Recording. Welcome to Investable Nuclear. The hard questions over the next hour and a half or so. We'll try and explore what questions people interested in investing in nuclear should be thinking about. A number of esteemed panelists have joined us. Our kickoff speaker will be Will Fork. The bios for everybody are available on the web link, but I wanted to at least highlight one aspect of it, which is that prior to being a partner at Pillsbury, Will was general counsel of ENIC, which has now got over 4 gigawatts of nuclear on the grid. Joining us from Bangkok, where it's shortly after midnight, is Wendy Simon Pearson, who was general counsel for UltraSafe, a startup nuclear reactor vendor. With me in the room is Mark Herlock, who is a partner with Sutherland and has represented over the years, as many years as me, and I don't think either one of us will admit it, various reactor vendors. And of course, with us then is also Seth Gray, who, amongst other things, before it was popular, managed to take Lightbridge through an initial public offering, an IPO, on the long list of accomplishments for the panel that you can review on the website. With that, I will turn it over to Will, who will give us some thoughts on due diligence. So.
Okay, thanks so much, Bud. I sort of like to start out by saying it's great to be here with really this amazing and esteemed panel. So we're very lucky to be here, and it's kind of fun to be in an educational environment here at GW, where we get to talk about a variety of things, and not only maybe questions, but also some answers to these questions on investable nuclear. I thought it might be helpful to sort of start out from the very beginning in terms of the environment that we're in today in the area of civil nuclear. And the reason for that is because there have been a lot of changes. And so if we sort of talk at a 40,000 foot level and look around the world, I wanted to talk through a little bit about what we're seeing in the international environment today, which is quite a different thing than it was even a year or 2 or 3 years ago. So starting from Europe or looking at Africa or looking at Asia, we're seeing a dramatically increased review and analysis and need for nuclear power that occurs across various jurisdictions. There are lots of different areas of key collaboration within the Americas, within Asia, within Europe in particular. And a lot of that has been driven by geopolitical changes. And I think that we can attribute that to sort of 3 major areas, one of which is the geopolitical environment in the context of Russia and China, and the need that's been recognized by some countries in the context of energy security. So what is energy security? What is the importance of energy security? What is the impact to the local populace and to the cost of electricity, not only for today, but over the long term? In addition, we've had a lot of changes in analysis coming out in the area of the recognition of the need for low carbon electricity generation. And so when we look at the various energy sources, I think there's been a realization across the board, and that's occurred in the European Union in the context of the European Union taxonomy for nuclear. It's occurred under the IRA in the United States, but it's occurred in a variety of areas, in the recognition that nuclear can play a very important role in the production of low carbon baseload electricity production. And that in turn has influenced decision-making processes, both in corporations and governments internationally. Interrelated with that is the recognition that some of the decision-making processes belong to the state. So not everything is based on private markets, private cost, individualized cost at a low level. In the area of nuclear, I'll talk about this a little later in my presentation, but we like to say that that nuclear is the province of governments. The risks associated with nuclear, whether it's the financial cost, whether it's the regulatory cost, whether it's a variety of other political implications, or the fact that we have high amounts of money that required for the construction of new nuclear, requires state assistance. And so the decision-making process, when we combine together the low carbon goals, the need for energy security, has been exacerbated by the recognition and discussion by states in terms of what the decision-making process is for the possibility of new nuclear plants. Today, there are 426 operating nuclear reactors in the world, and about 56 units that are under construction. And so what that I think means in general is that we're seeing, a lot of new nuclear, but primarily that's in the area today of countries like Russia and China. The change in the last year has been, what other countries and capabilities exist in other countries for new nuclear. And I think that's where a lot of the time and effort that we're seeing and changes that we're seeing on the international nuclear front are starting to appear. And that, if we look back down at the list in particular, we can look at the United Kingdom, where they have the great British nuclear program, which was just recently established. We can look at France. About a year ago or so, President Macron said, "Look, we need to have new nuclear. The EPRs are going to be part of the future of nuclear in France." A bill was passed by the French Senate in the fall of last year for 6 new EPRs with the possibility of additional EPRs on top. And then just yesterday, the National Assembly of France approved the plan for 6 EPRs and the possibility of a fairly significant growth of large-scale nuclear within France. And that comes combined with the nationalization of EDF, which is now about 90% owned by the French government, and that's going to be probably shortened down to something smaller than that in the future. Within Europe, we can look at lots of different countries, whether it's Finland, the possibility of replacement for the power at the Finland program, at Sweden, where the Swedes have made a new political change for new nuclear. Norway is looking at the possibility of new nuclear. The Netherlands is looking at new nuclear. Of course, one of the major programs is the Polish program. There's both a program that's active in the context of the AP1000, the U.S. reactor design, as well as the APR 1400 Korean design. Romania, Bulgaria, Czech Republic, even the Italians, et cetera, et cetera. So we're seeing just a very significant change in the context of is there a possibility for new nuclear? And that's why we're going to talk about some of these topics today. I'll say briefly about the United States, same concept. We're finishing up the construction of two units in the United States. And then we have a whole fleet of different small modular reactor vendors, and the recognition that with the IRA, with federal government support, with the loan guarantee programs, that there's a good possibility that some of the small modular reactors will be of the right cost and size and capability to replace some of the coal plants in the United States and help to work on decarbonization. Similarly, in Canada, there are some great initiatives going on. And then within Asia, we're seeing some significant changes. So in Japan, which of course has been trying to reduce itself from the nuclear reactor, from nuclear after Fukushima, they're back up to 10 units operating today, and they expect to be up at 22% of total electricity production in the next few years if we get approvals from the regulatory side. The Korean government has changed and is now working on new nuclear. And then other governments in Southeast Asia, including the Philippines, Malaysia, Indonesia, and others, are all in the possibility are looking at the possibility of use of nuclear. In fact, just yesterday, there was an announcement made in Indonesia in the context of the United States providing support for advanced reactor designs in Indonesia. And that's one of a variety of different U.S. government programs that are acting to assist on new nuclear. When we are looking at the possibility of a new nuclear build project, who are the folks that will be investing? And so we can break that down into 2 different areas. One is in the context of the government. And remember, governments play an important role in these large civil nuclear projects. And so often they can be utilities. And of course, those utilities can be owned by the governments or partly owned by the governments in many cases. The most common source of financing is balance sheet financing. And again, that could be coming from the government or it could be coming in directly from private markets. And then you can have the reactor vendor itself. In some cases, the reactor vendors in the past have been interested in actually providing equity so that there's a shared goal for both parties once the plan is complete, that they can share in the profits, assuming there's a good PPA that enables that to occur. And then you can have sort of private financing. But one of the things we like to say is we've never seen a private project financing of a nuclear plant. Okay, so It's still, kind of a road too far at this point, particularly for the large plants to have project financing. But some of the concepts and ideas that apply for project financing apply in the context of nuclear. And often when we are brought into nuclear projects, we're asked to essentially set up a program that looks a lot like something that is investable from a project finance perspective, even though ultimately it's unlikely that we'll see actually project finance occur in the context of a large project. Part of it has to do with governance, it has to do with proper payments, it has to do with risk management, and all of those concepts that apply well for a large developing project would apply well for a nuclear project for the most part as well. I mentioned earlier that we say that nuclear is the province of governments. And why do we say that? Well, part of it has to do with the fact that nuclear is in this highly regulated environment. That, of course, is because primarily of the safety concerns, but it also has to do with political concerns. It has to do with transboundary effects, the possibility that you can have a nuclear radiological release that occurs across boundaries. That means that the siting and the location of the plant will make a difference in some cases. We talk about the high need for government support, and that applies across the board. It applies at sort of the national level, it applies at a local level, at a regional level. It applies across different agencies, whether it's the environmental agency or the nuclear regulatory agency or the finance agency or the export control agency. All of those different agencies have to sort of work together, and all of those are points of potential failure in the development of a nuclear project. As I mentioned earlier, there's never been nuclear project financing, so that you're going to have money that comes from the government in some capacity. You have large and long construction periods, which is in contrast to various other sources of energy production, whether it's renewables or gas or coal or others. And then probably most importantly is the high capital cost. And so as an example, when we completed our first major contract for an EPC contract with the Emirates, the public number was $18.1 billion. We're looking in the United States at 2 units, well over $30 billion for AP1000 reactors. And it's sort of the same in different jurisdictions in the United Kingdom and others. So the high capital cost means that everything has to be particularly well considered, well thought, and the risks get greater as the financial risk increases. Okay, so I wanted to turn next to some of the considerations that are looked at in the context of due diligence for a new build project. We'll start with a little bit of philosophy. And so this is philosophy probably from the owner's perspective, but the owner's goal is what? It's power. That's the goal. The goal is power. It's also safety, but it's the idea that the owner is trying to produce electricity and sell that power to the grid. And of course, it has to fit within these contexts of energy security, baseload power. It has to be acceptable in terms of cost at the end of the day over a long time period, amortized over 60 or 80 years for the local populace. We generally start with the idea that all major nuclear technologies are safe, whether that's an AP1000 or an APR or an APR 1400 or a VVER or a CAP1000. Any of those technologies have been built, they are running, they're operational, they are safe, they're safe units. We also tend to think about the idea that legal work can be a contributing factor to the success of a nuclear power project. So the strong foundation of a project is often the legal foundation. We'll talk about some of those aspects. And then ultimately, we're trying to reduce risk. And so you can take risk in many different ways, but is the project being developed in a way that reduces risk across the board in the most simple but effective way? So we'll talk first about the legal foundation of a nuclear power program. First relates to strategy. The development and construction of a nuclear power plant doesn't just happen on its own. It happens in the context of a government strategy for how they're going to produce electricity. Seth Gray, for example, did a lot of work in the UAE in the early days and helped to develop a very sound strategy in the context of a fleet strategy for a new nuclear unit program. And why is that important? Well, it's primarily important because the most successful nuclear programs have been fleet units. And you can apply that in the United States, you can apply that in France, you can apply that in the United Kingdom, you can apply that in Japan. As you are producing, or as you're constructing units and you get your first or second units constructed, all of a sudden your success rate is much, much higher, much more likely to succeed. You'll have a much firmer understanding of what the total costs are going to be. Your supply chain is going to, be in existence. And so the more that you can have a fleet of units of similar design, the more successful the program is going to be. Additionally, intersections with the government. As I mentioned before, you have to know how the program is going to work with the environmental industry, the ministry, and understand what the limitations are. One of the options when you develop a program is you can sort of set up the nuclear program on its own so that it's completely on its own. So all of the key points of failure, which could include siting, environmental considerations, transboundary effects, and so forth, are all decisions that are made by the nuclear program itself. If you have a program where the nuclear law and the nuclear scope of control is limited, and then you have to work with other various intersecting agencies, as you have in the United States, for example, the more difficult it becomes. The more likely that you have another agency that will cause an issue in some way that can restrict or limit or cause the program to fail. In terms of laws, we can look at the legislation. So we look at the nuclear law itself. We look at the licensing requirements. Sometimes we say, particularly for a new build unit, what's the right regulatory system? And part of our answer typically is that the regulatory system ought to be at a very high level. It ought to be maybe US NRC or IAEA standards for certain key areas like quality assurance or safety or siting or some of the early areas. But when you are selecting a new program, you want ultimately, if you can, to accept the regulatory system of the country that you're bringing in. That will reduce friction points. It will reduce the possibility of failure. And because we start with the assumption that all of the nuclear programs that are essentially under consideration by countries today are safe, you can rely to a certain extent on the regulatory system that you're taking in. And then if you need to relook at it or tweak it or revise it, then it's easier to do that than to create your own regulatory system and then ask a foreign vendor with its own regulatory system and incorporate that into yours. It's just additional friction points and increases the possibility of failure. Another area that we look at relates to diplomacy and the issues of interactions between governments. And this typically involves the ministries of foreign affairs. In that context, we look at the peace agreements for peaceful nuclear cooperation. Those exist bilaterally between countries worldwide. In the context of the United States, we have what's called a 123 agreement, which is referred to Section 123 of the Atomic Energy Act. But the idea being that if you're going to have a supply chain, you'll have to have bilateral agreements. You'll have to have an understanding of the export control systems, and you'll have to have a good understanding of all of the supply chains that are involved in a program. Similarly related to that, as a base level, it is acceptance of the IAEA safety standards, whether that's a plan or existing CSA comprehensive safeguards agreement or an additional protocol on the IAEA safeguards piece. Sometimes you'll have to have special export control dual use controls within the country to be able to enable that to occur. And then lastly, nuclear liability. There are certain nuclear liability conventions, the Paris Convention, the UN Convention, the Comprehensive Safety CSC, that enable nuclear liability to be properly handled. Outside of diplomacy, transactional, we look at primary transactional documents. The first one is what we call an invitation to tender. If you are in a competitive environment, not always in a competitive environment, but if you are in a competitive environment, which does have significant advantages in some areas, you would review the invitation to tender and the primary terms related to that. We like the idea of competition in a lot of ways because it does provide leverage. And if you're the owner, if you're the government setting up the program, and you're in competition, you'll find that there are great advantages from price and terms and conditions and a variety of other areas that typically fit together. Other agreements that we typically look at are early works agreements. We look at or draft the prime contract between the vendor and the owners. And then there's also lots of other contracts, every kind of contract you can imagine, from hotels to real estate to IT and engineering contracts. Okay, another area that we would look at in the context of the new program relates to the project's foundation. So there are many, many stakeholders in a new program. You have not just the relationship, although it's the key relationship, between the owner and the vendor. That's the key relationship. But outside of that, there are many, many, many stakeholders. And whether that's the electricity grid, whether it's the local populace that may have concerns, whether it's the local community that wants to have, a nice school, nice schools, and a nice place to be, typically in a remote location. You can sort of draw your, diagram. But there are many, many stakeholders who are involved, and a lot of that has to do with communication. And so one of the things we talk about quite often in the tenets of a successful solar nuclear program is the importance of communication and a really good PR agency or way of communicating. And that occurs at the project level, it occurs at the corporate level, it also occurs at the national level. And all of those communications have to sort of work together so that the local people understand what the purpose of the program is, why solar nuclear is safe, what the company is doing to ensure safety, how it's going to interact with people, those things. In terms of the contract, the prime relationship between the owner and the vendor, we typically, ideally, would have what we call a requirements contract. A requirements contract is a contract that says not that the vendor will meet Appendix A with all sorts of very, very particular specifications related to the exact diameter of the piping and the type of welding and the quality of the persons. It's a requirements contract which says you, the vendor, will construct, procure, and engineer a nuclear reactor that will meet the following objectives, the following requirements. It will produce 1,400 megawatts electric. That electricity production will occur at a 90 to 92% capacity factor over a 5-year period. All of the requirements in that, all of the engineering that's done will meet AS&E standards met and have some specifications. It will have the highest levels of security consistent with XYZ standards. Anyway, a set of requirements. And the whole idea there is to take, it's kind of like the old analogy of a big jar, and you put in, big rocks, and then you put in the kind of smaller pebbles, and you put in the sand, and then you say, maybe put some water in. Okay, the requirements contract concept is one that is designed to try to fill up all of the holes so that it's difficult for the vendor not to produce what the owner ultimately needs, which is safe baseload power that operates for a long time period efficiently and so forth. We like to have a turnkey scope so that, ideally you are not just dealing with multiple vendors, but you're dealing with a single prime contractor if you can do it. Sometimes you can't do it. We like to have mostly fixed price so we know exactly what the total cost of the project is going to be. Sometimes you can get that, sometimes you can't. Typically, the reason why you can or can't get that is whether or not the reactor vendor has produced that unit successfully over a number of years. So if they've produced, 5 units, they know what the cost is, they know what the supply chain is, they're going to be more likely to be able to give you a fixed price contract in contrast to an engineering company that may not have that experience. We like to have payment in hard currency. Typically, that means U.S. dollars. Even today, things are changing in the world to a certain extent. But U.S. dollars typically are still the primary currency. You have baskets of currency to provide protection in certain areas. We like to have payments based typically on milestones, so that we know that payments are being made consistent with the actual success of the construction of the project. And then we look at things lawyers love to talk about, which are stuff we like to look at, which are indemnities, limitations of liability, clauses like that are important to make sure that both parties are protected. In terms of the vendors, we look at questions like, can the vendor deliver? Can they deliver? Do they have experience in delivering? Do they have a reference plan that is complete or nearly complete? Can they sign a contract quickly? One of the key areas of success is time. Time is money. And sometimes it takes time to make a decision to enter into a new contract or to make a decision on a nuclear program. And governments don't always operate, at the speed of light, as we all know. But ultimately, once you get into the decision-making process, where the government has approved the program, can the contract be signed quickly? Can they build it quickly? That's a very important part, because as soon as you have significant personnel on site that are making decisions, lots of money is being spent, and every day counts. Ultimately, we're looking for low risk. We're looking for the best warranties. We're looking for price risk guarantees. We're looking for the best financing, and we're looking for sometimes technical cooperation agreements. Generally, for new programs, we don't advise technical cooperation agreements. We generally say that new build programs don't need, all of the intellectual property, and that's probably a road too far for most new countries. But for mid-sized countries or countries that have been in the nuclear industry for 20, 30 years, sometimes the TCAs make sense. Okay, I'd like to turn now over to sort of the last area, which is due diligence with respect to the vendors. And so there have been a plethora of new designs in the nuclear industry in the last 10 years. I think you could say that some of these designs have been around actually for 50 years, and they're just taking old designs and they're bringing them out of a box to a certain extent. But there's a lot of funding behind these, a lot of private companies, and it's frankly a very exciting time for the civil nuclear industry. And so whether that's NuScale or PWX-300 or PWX Energy or ARC or TerraPower or Kairos or ultra-safe nuclear, we've got our General Counsel at ultra-safe here. It's an exciting time. And what that means is there's a lot of investments that require due diligence. And so one of the ways that our SMR vendors have been able to raise money is through investments from foreign countries. I was in Tokyo 2 weeks ago or so and had an opportunity to talk through the Japanese opportunities in the civil nuclear industry. And one of their main ways of participating is through investments. Okay, and so that's whether that's IHI or JBIC, or of course Hitachi in combination with General Electric. There have been the Koreans have been investing in civil nuclear. So there's a lot of opportunity for investments. And so maybe this is why we're having our discussion today. Okay, to talk through, what are the considerations that companies like that ought to be looking at. First of all, what is the business case for the small modular reactors? One of the things that's very interesting about some of these SMRs, and of course there's a safety case that's advantageous in certain cases, that is sometimes offset by the fact that if you have a light water reactor, it's easy to get the VCD, and you're able to get it certified more easily. But some of the business cases are quite different. So, for example, we can look at steel producers that are now looking at small modular reactors. Dow chemical companies are looking at small modular reactors. Large companies that have made promises in the context of low carbon emissions, like Microsoft and Apple, are looking at the possibility of whether small modular reactors could be a possibility. So now the business cases are quite a bit different, even than they were maybe 10 years ago when some of the small modular reactor vendors were in the process of building their business plans. Additionally, there's a lot of subsidies, so U.S. government support in different ways, and that support occurs not just in the United States, but in various other countries. Key areas of diligence for the small modular reactor or the new build designers, we ask the question, is it licensable? If it's licensed by the NRC, it's a very strong sign. But the NRC is not the only game in town. Of course, the Canadians are out there. Other countries are. Sometimes the business case involves unusual locations. Can the design be built on a oil derrick? Can it be built on a large barge? What are the legal and regulatory implications of a design that's kind of a little bit off the beaten path in terms of capabilities? Can the EPZ site boundary be changed? Can the number of operators be changed? Bud and I, 13 years ago, wrote a paper for ANS. Wrote a paper on some of those subjects, and it's moderately exciting to see some of the ideas that were circulated 13 years ago are now approved by the NRC. Okay, Can the unit be constructed? Can it be operated? Modular construction is not always modular. I think it's one of the things we've learned in the context of the AP1000. Can we really build these? And even though the reactor vendors say it's modular, that means different things to different people. Is the fuel that is needed for the design available? So we have a conversation in the United States going on. Mark Perlak is an expert on nuclear fuel issues, and there's a lot of discussion about whether some of the HALEU capabilities can exist on time as needed for the small modular reactor vendors. Can it be sold? Where are the sales? Who can buy it? Who's willing to buy it? Is the cost and price point acceptable? Sometimes when you have large units, you have advantages in terms of economic benefits. Small modular can be smaller, the capital cost can be less, but the business case has to be demonstrated. UAMPS is an example of that right now, where they're looking at the cost changes and the cost of construction, and then maybe interrelated with that, issues today related to inflation. So when we look back at the United States fleet in the 1970s, built hundreds of units from 1968 until essentially 1980, 81, but kind of stopped in 1979. What was the reason for that? Well, the standard reason is because we had through Mount Island, there was a lot of regulatory concern. We had fire at Browns Ferry. All of the additional regulatory costs were part of the reason why the U.S. nuclear fleet stopped. Another way to look at it, however, was 1970 was also a time period of high inflation, massive inflation. So all of a sudden, by 1979, 1980, 1981, the decision-making process for new nuclear was not just merely based on regulatory costs, regulatory concerns, and safety concerns and political issues, but the literal cost of producing new power using nuclear, given the inflation rates, and the changes of those inflation rates from 1970 to 1980. Another issue related to intellectual property. Do the investors own the intellectual property? Do the owners own the intellectual property? What about all of the subsidiary companies that are providing the systems? Do they have a say in the intellectual property? Do they have a right to prohibit the parent company from being able to export into certain other countries because they're concerned about nuclear liability issues? Who owns the supply chain? Is it the primary, is it the parent company, or is it one of the subsidiary companies? How will that work in different countries, in the US, in Romania, other jurisdictions? And then lastly, what is the role of the government in ensuring success? In the United States, outside the United States, I think we've seen some changes. Traditionally, the U.S. government has not been as forward-leaning as it could be in the context of international nuclear exports of U.S. technologies. But in the last year, the U.S. government has started a number of programs, not all of them just this year, but there's what's called the FIRST program, which relates to capacity building programs, supporting energy innovation. There's what's called the We Can initiative with Japan, and they've started an initiative in Ghana. Project Phoenix, which is supporting cold nuclear SMR feasibility studies, and there are a variety of others, including in Ukraine. So I'll stop here, but I wanted to sort of summarize some of the key issues, and we've got a really first-class panel of people that have great expertise that can talk through some of these in greater detail. Thanks.
Thanks, Will. And as I set up this panel, what my hope was that we would explore at least the questions that are typical in due diligence. Will, I think, has helped us by also trying to provide some of the answers, but perhaps that'll be a focus of a future panel. I'm sure we all have our notes, and I'm going to go around the panel and just simply get their reactions to Will's insightful remarks about what are the scopes of the questions that get asked. But I think the big picture thing that we can take away is that a nuclear power plant project is complicated. There are a lot of questions. It's a lot of money. There are a lot of due diligence to be done, and I think Will have given us a long list of many of those questions that get ask when people are thinking about investing in nuclear. I will have to disagree, or maybe not disagree, on the one point about a fleet reactor. As an employee of a corporation that runs a 2-unit, 2 gigawatt plant, I will say, well, as long as we're willing to define fleet down as being more than one, perhaps there is there. But I think that's the point that we talk about in the complexity and the cost of a new nuclear project. There's no really one good answer. There's no one right answer that works for every situation. And so the heart of the due diligence is to ask questions like, well, what is the size of a fleet? What are the advantages that you would get if your fleet was larger? Are there ways of compensating for those flaws? Are there ways of exploiting the flexibility of being smaller? Like I said, these are the sorts of questions that I hope that we'll get kicked off. And let me go around to our panel. Let me start with Wendy and other people's reactions to Will.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you, Will, for introducing everything so well. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak here today amongst this enlightened panel of folks who are doing great work. I think that Will did a fairly good job of covering the whole gamut of the wide range of factors that investors are taking into account when they're deciding whether or not to invest in these types of different plants and reactors. I think something that's important to remember is that there are also different concerns depending on which part of the supply chain that an investor is looking to put their money. So if you're looking at placing money inside of an EPC, that's going to be different calculations than placing it inside of a reactor vendor, or the folks who are providing the fuel and the folks who are providing other sort of consulting services. There's an enormous amount of complexity in getting something to first power. So there's going to be different factors that come into each part of that process and getting things to market. I thought there was a good sort of explanation of the different types of investments that are going into these projects. My focus and background is working for a reactor vendor, an advanced reactor vendor. USNC, which is the company that I was general counsel for about 3 years, had a 5 megawatt electric, 15 megawatt thermal, high temperature gas cooled reactor, which is one of the 12 or so different reactor types that are in front of the NRC getting licensed right now, just in the United States. But there's lots of different funding available, and there's different types of considerations for the decisions to make each of those investments, as well as whether the reactor company accepts those investments and everything else. So as Will said, there's the issue of government investment, which is fairly important, not only for that kind of money to enter the private sector to get these things up and running, but also to indicate to the private sector that the government thinks that this type of technology can work. There's an enormous amount of credence that's given to even a tiny little loan that's granted from the U.S. Department of Energy. If the U.S. Department of Energy and their folks who are, giving out loans and deciding who to support in the research and the work that they're doing, think that something can get to market, think that the idea is safe enough, then investors in the private sector, who are oftentimes very finance focused and really don't have a deep understanding of the technology that they're looking at, they're going to use that as an indication of whether or not it's safe for them to invest in something like that. So that's these factors all sort of tie into one another. Another big caveat to the type of investing that Will was talking about has to do with export controls, which I believe Will mentioned briefly, but I'll go a little bit more into that. Since 2018, the U.S. government has the US government has always had an enormous amount of restrictions on the movement of information relating to nuclear and the investment and money flow of who controls nuclear information. But since 2018, there's been a marked sort of tightening of the enforcement of those restrictions, especially through the DOE's Part 810 restrictions and regulations. And what Part 810 governs is the transfer of even information relating to something like a nuclear reactor from a person in the United States to, for example, a person in Canada, or from a US citizen to a non-US citizen in the United States. So they're far-reaching, they're quite vast, they're expansive, and they cover basically everything that the nuclear reactor industry is working on right now. And so a lot of the international investment that originally would be sort of the traditional places where you would go for big money to be put into these projects is just a little bit more complicated. It's not that the funding is not available anymore, but there's a lot more restriction access what you can do with that. And another big one is that the folks who do CFIUS review, I'm not sure if you've covered that in your class as well, or if that's too sort of niche on the side, but it's becoming a much more important part of decision making relating to whether or not you're going to a big investment go through, and that's with friendly countries like Japan. And what CFIUS does is it's the U.S. government accepting an application from, for example, a U.S. company who, for example, wants funding from a Japanese company, but has to explain what are the controls in place to prevent a non-U.S. power from having control over what the company is doing and where the technology is going and how that information is controlled. And the statutory thresholds are ambiguous enough that, again, those types of regulations can tighten as the policy determination is made that that type of investment needs to be limited. So a threshold of 10% control over a board can be something that scraps a deal, but there could be more. It's that ambiguity is also something that creates risk in an investment. So that's a huge factor that is kind of esoteric, but that's where the lawyers come in and get to do some really interesting work. So I think that those are the gaps that I would like to fill in, because Will did such a good job going over everything. One other thing that I would bring up is wants to invest in something is international organizations as well. And so there's a lot of restrictions that are being discussed on, the World Bank and the IMF not being allowed to invest in nuclear projects. And, are those going to change? If they are, that's going to impact the entire investment portfolio for the whole industry.
Anyway, thank you, Wendy. And just for one of the many points you made, I think the Committee for Foreign Investment in the United States, or CFIUS, is not really necessarily nuclear specific, although I think the review takes on a little bit more of an exciting aspect when there's nuclear involved. But I mean, my company is in the process of selling wind turbines, wind projects right now, and one of the investors has interest in a country that shall be named, but might be referred to as China. And so that review is going to go through a CFIUS review as to whether or not that sale can go forward. But anyway, yeah. So the CFIUS and other international concerns don't necessarily just be the sort of thing that you put on the back burner, and God forbid Hart-Scott-Rodino be forgotten. But anyway, Mark, would you go next, please?
Sure. Well, Will did a terrific job at outlining a lot of the considerations. So let me just sort of focus on a couple of the things that he raised. I think you can't overestimate the governmental aspect of this. And whether it's geopolitics, because you're concerned about foreign direct investment reviews. And by the way, it's not just the U.S. now; it's Britain, it's France, it's everywhere. So you have that as a factor, but also just how, from a U.S. perspective, we stack up against some of the foreign competitors. So I think it's pretty interesting to note that, notwithstanding that we started all this, we sort of lost our way, such that if you look at our major competitors now, like Russia and China, and even France, which is a friendly competitor, there's a governmental flavor to what they do that is very difficult for us to duplicate. A related matter there, frankly, is our loss of resiliency, because we no longer have all parts of the fuel cycle. So when you start talking about exports, and when you talk about Part 810, fundamentally we're a bit handicapped in the abstract, perhaps not now because of the invasion of Ukraine, competing against the Russians, who basically can offer a one-stop shop. So I think from the standpoint of the industry, we'll raise the point of geopolitics and governmental issues. And I think that's a key issue for all of us just going forward, in terms of the ability to deliver technology and deliver it on time, and also make sure reactors get fueled and so forth. I guess another thing, just to note, is that when you think of putting together one of these projects, forgive me, I'm going to be a lawyer for a second here. Let's talk a little bit about what happens when disputes arise. And that's a really challenging part of the nuclear plant project, because you've got a technology vendor, you've got a customer that, as one knows, wants power. Then you got somebody in between called a construction company that's actually going to build the thing. And the challenge there, obviously, is making sure that there's not only a common objective, but there are some individual objectives. And how you set that up, I think, is absolutely critical. And if you look at some of the recent projects, including Georgia, you can see what happens sometimes when people get crosswise with each other, because it produces delay, additional costs, and we haven't even started to talk about the impact of current higher interest rate environments. And that's going to have a real market impact on the ability to deliver any project. And so, just talking about the dispute side for a second, I think one of the real challenges, and this is something that lawyers can particularly help with, is how do you separate what's absolutely essential to get the project done from things that, frankly, in the long run don't matter. I mean, what is it that leads the parties to really get at odds with each other, and how do you distinguish between the types of things that you really need to perhaps go to the mat on, and things that are just have to be resolved in the course of the project? So do you do that by setting thresholds and saying, well, if it's not above a certain level, we're not going to worry about it? How do you identify the things that you really have to talk about? And in that context, I think some of the structures we've seen that work better are some sort of management committee that puts an emphasis on resolving things quickly and making sure that you don't end up with a big long list of claims, which at the end of the day doesn't really benefit the project. So I would just say, one big challenge we can talk about here as lawyers is how do you set the structure up for success?
Right. Yeah. Thanks, Mark. Yeah, and certainly I wouldn't have the job I have today if it hadn't been for a construction dispute. And I think the points on due diligence to think about there is, what are the mechanisms that people are thinking about for due diligence, for dispute resolution? What does it say in the various contracts or project agreements? And has that dispute resolution mechanism been matched to the kinds of issues that come up? I mean, you want to have technical issues resolved by a panel of technical experts, et cetera, et cetera. So these are the sorts of due diligence questions that one can look at in a project and conclude along that line. And I will say that one of those advantages, I guess, of being small is that, especially in the United States, you can source your fuel domestically if you're so interested, if you don't have a very large project. And certainly that is an aspect of a project that you're thinking about, whether you're thinking about international deals or or local deals, or can you get your fuel from within within the site that you're planning on building in it? And if not, how are you going to handle the necessarily international aspects of not just fuel, but any of the other key components? But certainly somebody who knows something about a great deal about the fuel market. Set.
Oh, well, thank you, Bud. Thanks for the invitation to be here. It's an honor to be with such esteemed panelists. Thanks, Will, for such a fantastic overview and introduction. Well, one of the things that's interesting to me is not just to look at it from the point of view of a specific project trying to finance, build a AP1000 or whatever it is, and how you finance it. But we're seeing an increasing number of investors just interested in nuclear more generally. And what are ways that they can invest in nuclear, including in a diversified way, not necessarily just in one project. And what we really have now for the first time ever, we haven't had this before, is the ability for investors to invest in pure nuclear publicly traded companies listed on major US stock exchanges, and invest a little enough amount, either in the open market or directly invest in companies that come in below CFIUS thresholds, below really any legal threshold. They go on an E-Trade account and invest in publicly traded companies and really get diversification. So these include, for example, Centrus and uranium enrichment, PWXT, some fuel fan as a supplier company, Amoco for mining, Suno, 49% of Westinghouse, NuScale for a light water reactor SMR, X Energy going through the process now of becoming publicly traded for a advanced reactor, Lightbridge for advanced fuels. And it's just very interesting. We're starting to see some investors who are investing in Lightbridge who invested in some of these other companies. They're looking to diversify investments in nuclear. And that's really something that hasn't been possible before, because nuclear is either a relatively small part of a giant publicly traded company. It's difficult to invest just in the nuclear aspects, or as Will said, government owned or privately owned.
So can you speak a little louder?
Sure. And what was talking about on the energy security and decarbonization goals. At least what I'm seeing, I'm interested in what other panelists are seeing, is that the decarbonization is not yet as big a driver for nuclear in terms of actually seeing financing terms affected in a nuclear project. There's the European taxonomy, there's the IRA in the US, there's in the UK, similar movement. But in terms of actually affecting financing of a project, whereas I think state support relating to energy security is already becoming the driver. And that's where the movement is. And energy security, it seems almost every day, is broadening in terms of what does that mean. It's partly weaning allies off of relying on Russia or other countries for fossil fuels. It's partly avoiding sending so much money to Russia or some other countries. It's partly having more distributed power potentially toward SMRs and behind the meter applications at, say, X Energy plant in Dow, manufacturing plant or other industrial facility, versus a larger electric grid that would be more susceptible to all sorts of attack, physical or cyber. And more, I'm starting to hear of it in what might be more of a CFIUS-related emerging issue eventually, which is that when we talk about renewables and batteries, we're sending a lot of money to China and to Congo, and we're relying more and more on these countries. And especially if you're going to move toward a decarbonized future, and there starts to be issues in the CFIUS or other process about sending money to and relying on China, Congo, how will those work in the long term?
But mostly, I'll be interested in hearing the other panelists' comments relating to, when they think they'll see and how it might manifest itself, the climate-related actual advantageous terms for nuclear. For example, the European taxonomy seems pretty hard for a lot of companies to meet.
And Seth, I will agree. That's a great question. I will, for me, I will answer it first, and then go around in the panel in the same order to get their reactions to it. I will say this, that and one of the advantages, I guess, of being a small fleet, a 2-unit fleet, is that you get to belong to groups like STARS that include things like Diablo Canyon, and so the other members of Diablo Canyon have gone through and explained how they got to the point of now the exciting aspect of perhaps continuing Diablo Canyon beyond its current license life. But I think one of the lessons, at least from decarbonization in that story, is that Diablo Canyon is the next best alternative to what the state and local people preferred, which for decarbonization, which would be solar, wind, demand response, and batteries. And so I think that's one of those. At least that's my takeaway from current operating fleets, is where do you see decarbonization, is that if the nuclear becomes the next best alternative from that aspect, and then, like you said, people will invest in that if that is going to meet their energy security needs. But that's my reaction to Seth's question. Wendy, what's your thought?
Yeah, so it's a good question. I would just direct us directly back to the IRA. The IRA is the biggest single sort of injection of money into the industry, even though it's not an active injection of money, because the tax code is convoluted, and I wouldn't presume to say anything truly in depth about the tax code, because we'll leave that to the tax lawyers. But the IRA, for those who haven't been following it closely, in the past 6 months, essentially the definition of clean energy and the therefore eligibility for subsidies from the government for the type of power that you're producing through the tax code now includes nuclear, which is a huge game changer. The solar industry, the wind industry, has been largely pushed to the forefront and made successful by partially these types of tax-based subsidies that have been in place for the past 15 years or so, that have allowed them to come to fruition and to gain, an increasing portion of the energy market in the United States. And so while the IRA isn't going to feel as though it's directly impacting the industry immediately, long term, it's going to have just an enormous impact. It's going to change the risk-based decision making that public utility commissions are going to use in order to choose the mix of their energy providers for the next 5 to 10 years. It's going to be huge. I would not say to discount that. While it doesn't feel sexy, but it truly is going to have just an enormous impact on the industry. And I think that the other climate-related advantageous term that I would bring to the forefront is the idea that nuclear itself is such a long-term prospect, where nuclear energy, even the advanced reactors, we're looking at first power in the next 5 to 10 years, essentially, depending on, who's deploying, where they're deploying, et cetera, et cetera. And so because of that, when you're looking at nuclear, you have to have a long-term risk profile for what's going to impact what you're doing, and whether or not you can deploy, and what are the costs going to be associated with that. And in the United States, for example, that's what the state-based regulators like public utility commissions have to pay attention to when they're picking their energy mix for the next 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. And it is, at this point, it is foreseeable that in 10 years, in 20 years, there will be additional risks and ramifications for not having a carbon-free mix of energy that you're choosing for your sourcing. And so when you are making a determination at this point in time about whether to choose energy, whether to choose nuclear energy or to choose, a quote unquote clean gas plant, the risk has to be placed into that calculation that are you going to make back your return on investment in 20 years if 10 years down the line, there's an enormous tax placed on gas plants that are, emitting greater than X amount of CO2 per year. And so I think that that's also going to be a huge advantageous term for nuclear. And again, none of this stuff is the stuff that you want to be able to show your board of directors and say, aha, look, we've got it right here. But long term, this stuff is going to be hugely impactful.
Well, sure. Well, I think Seth's question is a really fun and important one in the context of, are the interests associated with low carbon, are they a contributing or a sufficient condition to get new nuclear built? And the answer is it's helpful, but not sufficient, I think is what Seth's saying. And I think that's basically correct. But the great thing about nuclear is when we think about nuclear in the context of governments, we also think about, if you look at the old nuclear units and the way the corporations were developed, they always had public acceptance. Does the public accept nuclear? Well, now all of a sudden we've kind of turned that on its head. We don't just accept nuclear, we need nuclear. And one of the things that's happened over the last decade is we've tried, with every type of asset, wind power, solar power, every kind of renewable asset to reach goals and objectives that have been set forth by the international community and then, of course, the state governments and so forth. And the reality is that those sources of energy just are not sufficient to meet those low carbon goals. Now, was that enough to get nuclear over the edge? Well, it's tough, but you add on to that the energy security, and you look at Europe, six-fold increased cost of gas in the country, increased cost of power in the UK, throughout continental Europe. All of a sudden, it becomes much more clear that we can do both. We can have that nuclear solves for some of the equations and the difficulties we've had that other renewable sources can't meet, and they also help to provide this energy security, baseload power that helps to reduce the commodity risks and the increase and decreasing costs that can occur when international events impact energy security.
I agree with Will. Response to Seth's query, I don't think the climate issue is enough to get us over the hump. At the same time, I think when you combine it with some of these other factors that we've been talking about, like energy resiliency, the combination, I think, helps move us down the road. On that score, I'd like to go back just to the issues we have with the nuclear fuel cycle, because, people say, well, nuclear will help with resiliency. Well, that's true, but only if we've got a robust fuel cycle here in the United States. And right now, we're still getting, for example, more than 20% of our enrichment from Russia under the suspension agreement. So you can ask yourself whether that really represents resiliency. In fact, there are congressional proposals right now to ban the import of Russian uranium. And one of the discussions that we sometimes get into is, well, if that happens, will we have enough to keep all the reactors running? I think the answer to that actually is yes, but that's a debate. And then when you look at things that are being done, and some of this relates to the IRA that Wendy was talking about, we need to start focusing on rebuilding the infrastructure we need to make ourselves successful so that nuclear can play this role for climate and energy resiliency. And we've got a lot of work to do there. I mean, some of that is, to take HALEU as an example. I mean, TerraPower has that, which was going to get its first load of fuel from Russia has now announced that they're going to be starting up later because they don't have a secure halage source. So all of these fuel cycle issues play into some of the ability to, what you need to do to make nuclear investment, at least in this country.
All right. Thanks, Seth, for that insightful question. Everyone's reactions to it. I would moving along in terms of actually getting to some of my questions that I had for the panel. I will say that one of the thoughts that I get from every year, outside bond counsel sends in due diligence questions to the corporation, and a handful of them land on my desk. And I would say that they group up in as what I would call threshold or enterprise risk. In other words, what is the reasonable assurance of nuclear safety? Are you going to be able to continue? Is the plant going to be the next 3 Mile Island, Fukushima? And those are sort of a level of due diligence questions we get. And I'm curious as to whether or not the panel feels like the questions along those lines, absolute safety, and the nuclear liability questions, that seem to be much of the historic focus that has come across is the be all and end all, or people are beginning to want to ask questions a little bit deeper in terms of the economics or some of the other issues we've been that Will kicked us off with and that we've been talking about for the last half hour or so. Why don't I start with Seth, since he didn't get to answer his own question?
Well, in answering your question, I'll say that I think that at least what we're hearing from some institutional investors we talk to is a notion that there's either much less and perhaps something that they're just not being very concerned about in terms of enterprise risk with some of the new SMRs, advanced reactors. We'll talk about the EPC site boundary, that particularly if just one unit might just be the site boundary across the street. You're not in the emergency planning zone, and where even in incident so contained inside, even on a multi-unit site, that you can keep the other units operating. And if say there's $3 billion per unit of several on the site, that might not be a threat to the enterprise, not the enterprise level. And I just think you can't get around enterprise level risk when you're gigawatt plus electric size reactors.
Wendy, you had an ultra safe, so Seth's question leads me naturally to: are we getting away from the threshold risks and moving on to the more prosaic, can we make money type questions? What was your sense from surviving through ultra safe in this experience?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I don't think that any of these vendors would have gotten to the point that they've reached if we weren't already at that point. And that is due to both increased sophistication of the investors themselves, and also what I've seen is a general greater acceptance of the idea that nuclear energy is necessary for a carbon transition, an energy transition to a more carbon-free energy. That I see with environmental activists and people who are not traditionally allies of the nuclear industry itself. And so there's still a need for very clear, very transparent communication about what on earth this stuff is and what does it do in layman's terms, where a person without a background in anything physics related can really understand it. But it doesn't have to be all of the technicalities. To a certain extent, people are predisposed to believe what's presented to them, which is great, because then you have these really smart folks at these, with these great designs where they really have dealt with a lot of the concerns that folks have had, both on the investment side and in the public for the past 70 years. And they're able to essentially convince them that their money is going to be safe and they're not going to fall into some sort of a public relations scandal for themselves and their other businesses. And the potential of an accident happening is very low. I know that for my old company, the particular type of fuel that we had put together that was proprietary, the whole concept behind that safety case was that the reactor heat itself never got hot enough to melt down the fuel. And so you had a system that was self-contained. And it was essentially a passive cooling system. And so once you're able to communicate those ideas simply to folks, you can get to the next step. As long as you have met that requirement and you check that box, people are willing to put it aside and to move forward with how do we actually get this thing deployed.
Will, you have any, you sort of kicked me off on this thought, so by threatening the fleet. I mean, obviously, I guess we can get to the point where you can take a gigawatt loss of power generation if your fleet's large enough.
Well, the way that I think we can sort of think about it is that these types of questions ought to be block and tackle. So what we want to do is remember the lessons learned in history and try to protect against and defend against those scenarios. And so we have to remember that the nuclear industry has great promise and there are great capabilities, but they're having failures. Westinghouse went bankrupt as a result of issues in the construction of nuclear units in the United States. There have been failures in the construction of nuclear plants, in vendor designs, and so forth at various points. And so part of the role of lawyers, the reason why we're hired to assist in due diligence, is to be repositories of that knowledge and repositories of that information, and to use the combination of our business knowledge and our historical knowledge of the industry, along with best practices in the way that corporations ought to conduct themselves, whether they're constructing a new nuclear unit or they're setting up a new nuclear design or things like that, but using a combination of all of those different areas to provide advice through a diligence system. And it is a system. It's not. It is designed to be blindfolded to a certain extent. It's supposed to be fair, and it's supposed to not ignore the tough questions. And that's kind of going to your questions today. These are not easy answers sometimes, and sometimes they're questions that have to be considered. And then at the end of the day, it's the decision making of the investor. The investor gets to make those decisions. They get to look at the risks and the profiles and the possibilities and the opportunities, and then put their money to work knowing what the risks are.
Well, another way of putting it is, I mean, as lawyers, we're in the business of creating predictability and reducing risk. So the investor is going to have to decide whether he or she can accept the scenario that you lay out. And there are different tools you can use, there's different ways of approaching this, but that's where the lawyers can help.
Right, and well, Mark, and along those lines, I was wondering if you could also answer our, at least kick us off on our on the question that's been asked by the audience. The build, own, operate, transfer model isn't that much different than the Vogel model and some of the aspects that, to a certain extent, a company like Oglethorpe or participants in it would have seen. They were expecting somebody else to build, own, and operate. And obviously, the key question comes in is how reliable is the company that's promising to give you this boot? Is I mean, if it's backed by a sovereign wealth fund with $178 billion, you can probably count on their promises. But I think that the builders, the owners of Vogel, found that necessarily even the promises from a multinational, terribly large corporation based in Japan doesn't necessarily get you a plant built if that doesn't look profitable to the partner. If the fleet isn't large enough, it's shrunk down to 2. But so I think it's logical, maybe perhaps for you to start off and answer our first question about can the U.S. vendors compete with companies that are countries, I guess more specifically, countries that are offering a food model.
I don't think they can without the lot of government support. I mean, as a realistic model, I mean, let's just take Russia, since Russia's sort of the flavor du jour here on a lot of stuff. No secret, what Rosado has been doing for years is basically acting as a vehicle of geopolitics for the government of Russia. And the way they've done that is basically come in and said, you're Turkey, you'd like to have a nuclear reactor, we've got a deal for you. And so they offer them every single piece of that, and it's very seductive if you happen to be Turkey. So how do we compete against that? Well, part of it is what I was talking about earlier, which is we have to revitalize the nuclear fuel cycle. If you know, the report of the Nuclear Fuel Working Group a couple of years ago has, notes this. It doesn't really give you a full blueprint, but some of what's happened recently legislatively certainly reflects some of the concerns that are in that report. But so one aspect of what the U.S. has to do is to make sure that we've got the capability so that we're able to compete. Now, on the financing side, obviously, we also need support there because that's something where the government has to take a role. And I think it's really true that that's been a big disadvantage of competing against the Russians. What you hear from a lot of the U.S. companies is, yeah, it's really hard to sell because we're competing against Russia Inc. and now China Inc. and to a certain degree Korea Inc. So let's stop fooling ourselves here. We need some government involvement.
Seth, I've heard you echo many of the thoughts that Mark just laid out. I mean, do you have any other insights on U.S. competition?
No, I agree. I think this gets easier as you get to smaller reactors, especially at smaller number of unit sites. But I totally agree with what you said.
Look, I want to make sure we touch on something, but maybe you're going to get at it. This is the interesting thing with smaller reactors. This is where diversity may not help us. We can't build a lot of them. We can't have a lot of designs. In theory, it's a great technology, but who's going to decide which ones we build? Is the government going to do that?
Yeah. There will be some that will succeed. There will be some that don't. There might be some that combine. But right now, there's about 70 of them being tracked at the IAEA. I don't think we'll be seeing 70 deployments of different kinds of reactors.
So I don't know if anybody has details. How much did it cost NuScale to get regulatory approval?
$500 million, 2 million pages.
That's not going to happen for 70 designs.
And I'm not 100% sure that the NRC has enough staff to answer to do that amount of work.
Well, make it worse. I mean, Will and I last October were at a meeting here in Washington where people were discussing regulatory approvals across international lines. So the head of the NRC came and talked to us and said, well, we're not going to cede any of our role here to accept what the Brits or anybody else or the Canadians do. Well, think about that as a barrier to building a lot of SMRs.
Anyway, questions we've got from the audience. One of them I want to throw out. It's rather long up there. I think you guys can probably see it. But I mean, the basic question is one of the I think we've been talking about, which is energy security and grid resilience. And Will, I was wondering if you might want to comment on the idea of, or I can answer it, which is, do you build natural gas? I think the due diligence questions are you building your natural gas facility in a place that provides baseload? I mean, if you are on the wellhead, that's a different situation than if you're relying on a pipeline or liquefied natural gas coming over from Algeria. I mean, that's sort of questions you want to ask is nuclear the right thing? And for this particular question involving Michigan, which is at the end of a pipeline and doesn't have very much natural gas, it's not, well, a little bit coming from the north, but is very much on the end of the pipeline, finds itself frequently, well, I wouldn't say frequently, but more often than comfortable with the governor issuing restrictions asking people, please don't use your natural gas to heat your homes. But anyway, perhaps you could comment a little bit on the kinds of questions that people will be asking in resilience if they're going to compare a small modular reactor to a natural gas project. Other than the ones I've just sort of.
Well, I guess this gets to sort of philosophical question of of analyzing energy security in the context of diversification against cost. So today you can get gas for very, very cheap, and you can build a gas plant for a lot, not very much money, a fraction of the cost of a large nuclear plant. Is the cost of a pair of nuclear units, amortized over X number of years? We have to remember that it's amortized. It's not just the initial cost. It's over 80 years. So all of a sudden that big cost, gets a lot lower, longer, especially when you consider inflation. So these are actually decisions made by governments. Governments have to make these decisions. Utilities are not well suited for that in a sense. Sometimes if you're a big enough utility and you have a member of a board of directors that has the ability to think long term over a 20-year, 30-year period, then you can start to make those decisions and then coordinate that with the state government and FERC and so forth. But often that's not necessarily the case. And the easy answer for a typical U.S. board is, look, nuclear is large and it's expensive and it incurs certain risks. Is that a benefit to our corporation where the objective of our corporation is not really energy security? It's not necessarily energy diversification. It's to ensure that we have an ongoing concern that makes money for the shareholders, that provides electricity to the rate base. And so that's where sometimes we have to think, I think, from a policy perspective, where do we tweak and where are the tools that ought to be used? And this is probably something the U.S. nuclear industry has to think a lot about. We have to explain the value of nuclear, and it's not just value in cost, and it's not just value in low carbon. It's value in energy security, baseload power, especially when it's cold in Michigan.
And can you get it? I think one of the other questions we've been talking about here that we've gotten, which is that the reason we're getting into these more due diligence depth of questions that we've been talking about is because we are, I think, with SMRs and certainly with some of the reliability that even the large plants have had, we've gotten over the threshold enterprise, over that fear. We're now getting down to the more detailed questions of, does it meet a basic need? Is it something that people want? So let me go to, let's take up Mark's question here. And Seth, can you talk, you mentioned a little bit about X Energy, which seems to be the source. And I think the question on there is, does that non-electrical load really need a new business model? I mean, as a utility, I've been kind of doing cogenerations under PUPA since the 1980s. So,
yeah, it's a great question. So Dow is not looking for electricity from this facility. They're looking for process heat for industrial processes and providing that from advanced small reactors deployed from X Energy, which is I think going to be a very reliable source of power for Dow. That actually needs a tremendous amount of power, but there has to be another party here that you're alluding to. The liability flows to the operator. Dow is not going to take that liability and be the operator. X Energy is not going to be the operator and take that liability. So, they're talking to utilities. And so you need a utility to come in at a Dow facility and operate a new kind of reactor that it's never operated before, never been licensed for commercial operation in the United States. And I think that will happen. That can happen. But a lot of legal issues with that. And that utility is going to take the liability of operating this facility at a Dow plant to provide heat, not to provide electricity.
Right, and I think that the question comes out, is that a new business model or a tweaking of it? And it depends on whether or not, because like I said, utilities have been running cogeneration facilities and industrial facilities and selling the electricity back onto the grid for decades.
But not a new kind of nuclear reactor that they haven't run before. And all the issues that go back through the supply chains of operating that, the fuel, the services, the maintenance, everything for decades. And, an issue just Will alluded to is, I don't mean any specific examples, but in general is, and you said too, what happens if your vendor goes away? What if the vendor fails and you're locking in this supply of fuel, of services, of parts, of so many things?
Yeah, I think actually on the due diligence side, I think the supply chain question is really critical because, we sort of are used to these really big enterprises providing this. I mean, you're going to Westinghouse, you're going to Siemens, or you're going to, Framatome or whomever, or sovereign government. Now, all of a sudden, with some of these designs, who is at the end of that supply chain? How vulnerable are they to financial problems or technical problems or just other types of business risks?
All right, Mark, maybe you can take the next question we've got from the audience, which is, and we've had a little bit of experience with the fuel cycle and the vendors' sensitivities of this. I mean, to a certain extent, one could argue that the spent fuel end cycle hasn't been solved because it's a problem that's time hasn't quite come yet. But it's certainly something that I've seen Congress has been asking questions about, which is whether or not these advanced reactors are something that needs to be considered, or at least considered by the DOE as part of the future of the future life cycle. Do you have a feeling on where we stand on the new nuclear technology spent fuel debate? What kinds of questions do you think people should be delving into there?
I don't think it's been much of a debate yet. I think right now this has just sort of been, at a very low level. I mean, just like the debate on spent fuel with respect to existing reactors, which we all know is, been, shall we just say, the risks have been overstated. Is that fair? I think right now there's just this sort of narrative that, it's better, but I'm not sure that anybody's really come to grips with it. I think the fundamental question that the industry's not done a really good job at is noting that it's really not a big deal. And look at what some people are doing in other parts of the world. And the issue's been hijacked by people who don't like nuclear as a convenient way to, cause problems. It's not called spent fuel, it's called nuclear waste. There's a reason for that. So I personally, I think it's another in the list of issues that the industry really has to, thoughtfully address to explain the risk. I think somebody talked earlier about public acceptance, and it just, in many respects, has not been a very effective job done at talking to people about the science, about what the real risks are. And slightly off point, but it's something I had some personal experience with when the Reactor USA plant was being sited in Mexico. What they did was they took people from that part of the state and flew them to Alma and showed them effectively the reference plant, which by the way is right next to a residential area, to show them that there really wasn't much of a risk. And they, that helped sort of calm the waters a little bit. And so there was a very active effort to try to convince people that, look, there's not really a risk here just because the N word's involved. And as we all know, the industry has struggled to get the word out.
Right. I think, Mark, that's kind of the point I was trying to get to, is that when we start with these threshold, is the enterprise okay? Can we do it type questions? And once we get beyond those questions and people can see that other people have been operating these sorts of facilities, other people have been doing reprocessing, then I think we get into the next level of questions. Like I think, for example, Oklo struggled with, which is they were going to reuse fuel. Well, how much for credit should they get if you don't know what the next best alternative is? How do they underbid something that has been valued at the Department of Energy at anywhere between $2 trillion overfunded to $7 trillion underfunded? So I think that's the importance of the due diligence, is when they move from, we've gotten these threshold questions to the more detailed questions of, well, if we're going to reuse it, what should we pay to do it? I don't know, Seth, do you have any? I know you've done a lot in terms of rethinking about how to reuse this fuel cycle. So
yeah, but it's ultimately going to be government that's going to answer the value question. It's going to drive this, or courts after it's litigated, once government decides. And right now, most people in the industry say it's cheaper to mine new uranium than convert, enrich, fabricate fuel than to reprocess. But there's a lot of reusable material and energy in that fuel. And with new techniques, new reprocessing techniques, yeah, we may get to reprocessing is the answer here, and reusing in reactors. That's certainly something Lightbridge is working on with our fuels.
Well, Seth, you probably know more about this time. Just, the original TerraPower project would have reused material. I mean, no reprocessing required. And this was the Bill Gates effort that they were in a joint venture with the Chinese on. And so, I mean, there are, to your question about advanced reactors, I mean, there are a variety of solutions. It's not necessarily reprocessing the way the French do or British did in Sullivan.
And also, one other thing, with respect to the concept of due diligence, we've had a lot, part of this is education. So when we do due diligence for large private equity groups out of New York, a lot of what we will talk about to us is so obvious. We know that spent fuel is not waste. It's, all of these things, we know that the safety case is very, very minimal. And that you can put it in lots of different places. You can fit it all within, a very small container in the United States if you needed to. But when we do due diligence with the bankers on Wall Street, they are concerned about these issues, and they need to know. And so I think part of what we do in the diligence process is this kind of education on, it is not a problem. There's certain things you have to be concerned about. This is not going to be one of them. And to the extent that there are issues, here's what the risks are and so forth.
And thanks, Phil. And let me say that I think I'm reaching the end of my time here, and I want to give Wendy the last word. And I guess the last thing I want to say, or at least the second to last word, maybe perhaps, is just that for those of you who tuned in to see Irfan Ali, he was listed on the speaker. He is unfortunately under the weather and for health reasons was not able to join us. But turning to our correspondent from Bangkok.
Yeah, I mean, on the spent fuel stuff, it's one of the top things that people ask about. And so in order for this industry as a business model to work, there has to be a good answer for it, both in the due diligence process and when speaking to the public. But the important things to remember about that are that there has never been a significant spent fuel accident in the United States in the 70 plus years of having spent nuclear fuel. The totality of spent fuel used in nuclear reactors in the United States could fill one football field to a depth of about 10 meters in totality. And that because the DOE has not performed on its, the way that uranium works in the United States is that the DOE maintains title and never loses title to the fuel. And it's essentially, given on lease to the reactor companies that use it. And afterwards, there's an agreement that these companies have where the DOE is supposed to take the fuel back and to store it itself, and they haven't done that. And so during the interim period where the DOE has not performed, most of these different facilities stored on site. And so you have, very safe facilities that have not had accidents, that have, there's never been any deaths associated with it or significant accidents to the same effect. So there is data to back up the idea that this is a task that is not insurmountable. And it's a question of making sure that we speak transparently and we speak clearly to the people who are involved, that it is not an insurmountable thing, but will have to be essentially a political solution.
All right. Thank you, Wendy. I guess we've got two last questions to work through. One is to do with Part 53, which I don't think we could address in less than an hour. I will say that the NRC, Rick, last week should have Commissioner Caputo having moderated a session on Part 53, and I commend you to that if you want to learn a more detailed version of it. But in terms of the overall question, the concept, I think, is one we've been talking about. I don't know that any of the other panelists want to reiterate any of their previous points, but the government and an efficient reliable, effective, predictable government regulator is essential for business in this industry, whether you're in the United States or any of the other 173 countries that belong to the IAEA. Is it 172 plus or something? Don't quote me on the actual number there. But in terms of Part 53, I certainly recommend to go find the when it's available from the NRC Regulatory Information Conference. There's quite a good bit of discussion on Part 53 in that. And then I guess the last question we've got from Ryan Pickering has to do with finding labor and getting labor. And I will say that as somebody who gets to negotiate with unions endlessly about labor, carpenters are a big challenge. If somebody would like to learn how to work in wood and isn't afraid of radioactivity and nuclear power, there's probably an opening for you someplace in Michigan. But I thought we will end with that. We have about 10 minutes left, so if we go through the lightning round of what do you think about labor and any other final words on due diligence, and we'll start with Will, go to Wendy, Mark. So, go ahead.
Yeah, great point on the labor issue, and it's always complex, and it gets to sort of from a philosophical perspective of a new build program, what labor is going to be done in country, in the exporting country, and what's going to be done on site. And do the laborers on site have the requisite capability and experience to be able to produce the nuclear grade concrete, to produce a variety of things? And when you first start a program, the conversation typically is, if you're the newcomer country, we want to have 25-30% of all of the labor, domesticated. We want to basically do everything in country. The vendor says the opposite, and then there's a discussion. And our general advice is to put everything on the vendor, to give the vendor the benefit of the doubt on the decision-making process in that context. The vendor will be best able to determine what can be done in country and what systems are required in country to be able to manage and control the labor process. The most important thing is power, which means risk management and enabling the vendors.
Any other last words before we turn to Mark? Okay. No, I said Wendy. I said Wendy next. Sorry. Labor, and then any last words, Wendy, please.
Yeah, I mean, if anybody wants any job in this industry, everybody's hiring. Everyone wants the best people, and everyone's expanding so rapidly that there's not enough people to fill those shoes. There's not enough people who've done this before, which is kind of exciting because it really presents opportunities for people to shine and grow and really do something meaningful in an industry. But to that effect, I mean, Bud, the work that you're doing, teaching nuclear at GW Law, Donna putting together, Professor Atanasio putting together panels like this are important because people who wouldn't necessarily have, nuclear on the mind get told that it's an option. And if people know that it's an option, the earlier in their career that we can get to them, you can pull them in at all of the different crux points where that special technological expertise is needed. I had a couple of great conversations with folks when we were at the GW mixer that happened for energy law that happened a couple of weeks ago. And there were a couple of 1Ls that I spoke with who had never thought before about nuclear and wanted to learn more about it afterwards. So the earlier that you present this as an opportunity to folks, the better we'll be at recruiting people into the industry.
Three things. Education, and you already got a shout out live from GW for what you guys are doing, because the public really has to know how this fits into the picture, particularly the climate picture. They have to know that things like spec fuel aren't a problem, and that's still a challenge, number one. Number two, I think, government has got to be involved. There's just no way you can do these types of projects, deploy all the technologies people are talking about without the government having a role. And capitalism is wonderful, but this is one of those areas that it struggles because of the third point, which is you have to take the long perspective, and a quarterly profit sheet is not the way to be successful in this industry. So we have to somehow meet those three challenges.
And so,
Well, as Wendy said, everyone seems to be hiring in this industry. And I also want to commend you on teaching the class you're teaching and training lawyers in this area. We're going to need a lot more lawyers trained in this area. The engineering programs seem to be responding disproportionately greater than law schools, attracting people to realize the opportunities here. So I hope we get the word out more on the opportunities for lawyers too, along with so many other skills that are needed for this industry to grow. We'll talk about the work on the site. We talked earlier about modularization. I'd like to just talk for a minute about if we do get to the point where we have the factories producing the modules that are shipped to the site, those are going to be very highly skilled positions for the most part working in those factories. And if nuclear is going to play a major role relating to climate change and energy security, it's going to be with large numbers of these smaller units mass produced, like Boeing makes 737s, and out they go. And we're just not going to build thousands of new units on site with welders and complex piping, electrical and concrete boards and everything. You have to ship send more of that into these factories. Those would be great sources for skilled work. And with that, I just want to thank you. I think it's been a fantastic panel.
all right. Well, I want to thank all of my panelists. I want to say that those who are listening in or shoot us an email if you want to know where our next subject will be. The two takeaways I've got here are roadblocks to project finance for nuclear power plants, and a panel on describing the tax code, assuming that maybe I can find some accountants and somebody else who's willing to try to turn that into something we can get through in an hour. But certainly, and with all kidding aside, I mean, the tax code, and certainly in the United States, is a key thing to understand. And boy, I will say that there are a lot of people in any utility that are responsible not only for the tax lawyer aspects, but the tax planning aspects, the tax accounting aspects. It's a huge team to deal with the problem that everybody would like to have, which is making a lot of money and having to pay taxes on it. So with that, I think I've hit everything I was intending to get through. And again, thank Wendy, Seth, Mark, and Will for spending some time with us and talking a little bit about nuclear energy, investable nuclear energy, the hard questions.